This week on Newsmakers, Senator Gregg, ranking Republican of the Senate Budget Committee, joining us from the Russell Rotunda building. Good morning, Senator. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, Greta, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Two reporters here with me to help us out with questioning: Victoria McGrain of Dow Jones and Kevin Draba of Thomson Reuters. And Kevin has the first question for you.
Senator Gregg, how are you doing?
Great, Kevin. And you?
Good to see you. It looks like the financial reform bill is going to come to a final vote next week, maybe a little later, but pretty soon. And it seems like most people in the Senate agree that it will pass. And several months ago, the Democrats made a calculation that the political wind was at their backs on this issue and decided to press ahead with it, and thinking that Republicans would eventually not be able to stand in the way of it. Do you agree with that analysis? And did the Republicans mishandle how to address this bill?
Well, we've actually tried to offer amendments which we thought would improve it. We're not trying to stop it. There's nobody on our side that doesn't expect this bill to move forward. We have offered a whole series of amendments that have been addressing some of the very significant problems that this bill has. My opinion is that this bill in its present form, and it's getting worse rather than better right now with some of the amendments that are being adopted, will end up contracting credit on Main Street. It will end up undermining our ability as a nation to be competitive internationally, and it will probably make us less stable in the regulatory regime relative to managing our financial houses. So I'm very concerned about the direction of the bill, but nobody's trying to stop it. We're just trying to improve it. And yesterday there were a series of amendments offered to improve it. I've been co-sponsor of a number that have gone forward to try to improve it. Unfortunately, most of the amendments which would have, I think, moved this down the road towards creating a bill which the purpose of which should be to make our system safer and sounder and eliminate as much as possible systemic risk, and at the same time keep America as the best place in the world to create credit and capital so that entrepreneurs in this country have access to credit and capital, which is the key to creating jobs. Those two goals, which are the goals I want to see us pursue, have unfortunately been undermined by the bill as it's moved forward and developed here on the floor of the Senate. It is really a bill that I think will do some harm to our capacity to create jobs on Main Street.
So do you think it's going to pass next week?
Yes. Well, it's going to pass next week or the following week. I'm not sure when.
And how does this issue play politically in November going into elections? I know you don't face a re-election challenge yourself, but how does it play out in November? Well,
I don't think most Americans have really studied the intricacies of derivatives or the complexities of how the Fed regulates the bank or how the OCC relates to the OTS. So my sense is that most Americans look at this from 40,000 feet. They're upset with Wall Street. They're concerned about the economy. They're concerned about jobs. They're concerned about the recession that they have been through and that has caused them significant problems financially and a lot of trauma. And they would like to see Congress do something substantive in all these areas. But as to the actual nuts and bolts of this bill, I don't think most Americans have been able to focus on it because they're worried too much about either getting or keeping the job they have.
Senator Victoria McGrain here. How are you doing?
Pretty good, Victoria.
One of the areas I know that you and other Republicans are very concerned about is the derivatives portion of the bill, and the alternative section that was offered yesterday failed. Will there be further attempts to address this? Do you think, and if not by Republicans, do you think some Democrats will come back after Senator Lincoln's primary and try to fix it?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there. This isn't about the substance of derivatives, because I think most people recognize that the language in the bill is really destructive to our ability as a country to create credit. Many of your listeners may not understand what a derivative is. It's a pretty complex issue, but basically it's insurance. If you are manufacturing a widget on Main Street in Epping, New Hampshire, and you're selling that widget internationally, you want to make sure that when you enter into an agreement to sell that widget, that the price that you sell it at can be, the integrity of that price can be maintained in the face of a lot of things that you don't have control over, like the changing price of currencies, the changing price of the materials you put into the widget, changing price of the people you're dealing with, whether or not the company that you are selling into survives, for example, or goes into financial distress. All of that is insured over, and when you insure over it, you use something called a derivative. So it has a direct impact on Main Street America to first make goods and second sell goods and to borrow money and basically create economic activity. So it's a critical part of the oil that makes the economic machine of our country go. Unfortunately, the language in this bill will significantly, and you don't have to listen to me on this, but it will significantly contract the derivatives activities of this nation, and it will undermine the stability of the management and the oversight of this nation. That's not me speaking. The head of the FDIC, Sheila Bair, has said this. The head of the Federal Reserve staff has told us that this will be counterproductive to consumers and the banking and the stability of the banking industry. Chairman Volcker, one of the most respected voices in finance in the country, has said this, that this bill is fundamentally flawed on the issue of how it tries to regulate derivatives and will do harm, literally will do harm to our ability on Main Street to be able to get credit. So we did offer an alternative. It was voted down on a party line vote, and yet as you walked around the floor of the Senate, numerous, I'm not talking about one or two, but numerous Democratic senators would come up to you and say, oh, you know, we know we got a problem here. We just can't address it till, with a wink and a nod after next Tuesday when Blanche Lincoln's primary occurs. That's not the way you should legislate, folks. I mean, if it's bad law and it's going to do harm to this country's ability to be resilient and economically competitive, which it will, we should correct it. And the proposal to correct it was offered, and it was voted down party line. And that's extremely frustrating and does not lead to one having a lot of confidence that this bill is going in the right direction.
Senator, then have you heard that after Tuesday's primary that Democrats are open, willing to bring up an amendment to address this issue that you're talking about?
We don't intend to offer one.
But have you heard Democrats might do so?
If they do, wouldn't that be ironic? I mean, they voted down the opportunity to do it before the election, but they're going to vote for it after the election? I mean, what does that say about the integrity of the purposes of their bill?
Kevin, did you have a follow-up?
I was going to ask him about Fannie and Freddie.
Sure, go ahead.
One of the main criticisms of the Republicans have made of the bill is that it doesn't address the question of what to do about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And John McCain moved an amendment yesterday that would have sort of forced the issue here, but it was defeated. You said you thought the bill would pass next week, and presumably that'll be without any sort of Fannie and Freddie solution. What does that mean for financial reform?
Well, you know, there's the old phrase, the elephant in the room. This is the entire herd. I mean, Fannie and Freddie are at the essence of the problem that we had, which was basically a real estate problem, and the fact that real estate loans, which could not be supported because they weren't properly underwritten, in other words, the value of the assets which were lent against didn't exist or wasn't strong enough to support the loan, and the people who got the loan didn't have the income to pay the loan. And then Fannie and Freddie came in and basically securitized that loan and put the American taxpayer on the line to pay for that loan when it failed, when we knew that the loan wasn't made correctly in the first place. And so Fannie and Freddie have created a close to $500 billion obligation that the American taxpayer is going to have to pick up. And yet this bill acts as if it's not a problem. It doesn't exist. We don't have to address that factor. Well, that's foolish. You know, I mean, if the problem was the meltdown in the real estate markets, and it was driven in large part by the securitization done by Fannie and Freddie, then clearly you should address that and get the taxpayers off the hook for these billions of dollars, not trillions, billions of dollars of obligations. And so Senator McCain offered such an amendment. I was one of the primary co-sponsors. I suggested, my part of the amendment was that we actually disclose to the American people how much they owe here, how much they're on the hook for by bringing Fannie and Freddie on budget, since it is an actual obligation of the American taxpayer now. And it was rejected, which to me once again shows that this bill is probably less about substantively improving our financial system than it is about making a populist political statement reflecting an attack on Wall Street and trying to get some political points.
But Senator Dodd's point on the floor was that the McCain amendment did not include any sort of alternative for what to do with Fannie and Freddie, and that if it had passed, the housing market might likely have tanked and taken the economy back into recession.
Well, that's a hard argument to make when Senator Dodd's bill says nothing, absolutely nothing about Fannie and Freddie. At least Senator McCain was stepping up and putting out an idea as to how to unwind it, which was that it would be unwound over a few years by reducing its ability to make these loans and having to sell off the loans that already existed. That's a legitimate approach to unwinding Fannie and Freddie. If Senator Dodd had a better idea, he should have offered it. And it at least should have been in the bill. I mean, this is the biggest issue which we as a government have right now that is unresolved. We have a $400 to $500 billion liability that the American taxpayers are going to have to pick up because these loans, which shouldn't have been made in the first place, were securitized by an entity which claimed it had taxpayers standing behind it, and now the taxpayers do stand behind it because the government came in and took them over. How can you take a bill up on the floor of the Senate that deals with financial regulatory reform and totally ignore that issue? As I say, it's not the elephant in the room, it's an entire herd of elephants in the room, and it's totally irresponsible. And I just don't think Senator Dodd, as much as I respect him, and I do have a tremendous amount of respect for him, has a whole lot of credibility to attack Senator McCain's amendment when in his bill there was absolutely no proposal to address this issue.
Senator Gregg, looking back at how this bill has played out, months and months as negotiations went on, do you feel that Republicans at any point made a strategic error in terms of how they were negotiating with Senator Dodd, or when they sort of maybe accepted what Senator Corker seemed to be working out with Senator Dodd?
Well, that's Monday morning quarterbacking, and I'm not going to get into it. It's hypothetical. It is the way it is. We're at a point we're at. I think this whole bill started going south in the area of being a constructive piece of legislation which would significantly improve our financial industry, make it safer, sounder, and less risk-prone, and actually keep it as a viable industry so that Americans could get credit at a reasonable price and capital at a reasonable price. It went south when the White House decided to pull people back from negotiations on the Democratic side who were negotiating in good faith, in my opinion, with many of us on our side of the aisle, because they decided that they wanted a populist issue, and then you saw the president go out and light the wildfires of populism, which are still burning rather aggressively out here.
Senator, one of the most ambitious parts of this bill that Senator Dodd put together was to reorganize how banks are supervised, and he's backed away from that proposal in a series of steps. The last one was yesterday when the Senate voted to keep small banks under the Federal Reserve's, or a lot of small banks under the Federal Reserve supervision. What did you think of that proposal to begin with, and what's become of it?
Well, I never thought we should take the responsibility away from the Federal Reserve for the whole bank holding companies. My view is that the Federal Reserve is as good a regulator as any of the other regulators, that it was where that authority was going to end up. And you're basically moving deck chairs around by doing that. And as a very practical matter, the Fed has the resources and the expertise to be a very effective, and has been an effective regulator. I will admit, and I think anybody who looks at it closely admits, that the Federal Reserve was lax, as was the OCC, as was the SEC, as was the to some degree the FDIC, but much less degree, in the area of oversight. No question about it. But I believe coming out of this crisis, you're not going to see that type of event occur again, at least for the foreseeable future, or at least in the memory of the people who participated in it, the regulators who are in place today, because they understand that they made some big mistakes. But just moving these banks around for the sake of moving them around, I never saw that as being all that constructive, and I think it would have probably just disrupted things for a while. I think most of your financial institutions that are affected, and we're talking here about small banks, Main Street banks, regional banks. Most of them would rather have the Fed doing their audits and being their oversight than moving to a brand new agency and having to bring that agency up to speed on what basically is the activity that they're involved in. And really, most of those banks weren't the cause of, and weren't affected, and weren't basically the engine behind the economic crisis that we had, and they don't deserve to have to go through this huge relocation simply because we're trying to make a statement as to reorganization. So bottom line, I think the idea of taking all this authority away from the Fed was probably not a good idea, and I didn't support it from the beginning.
We have about 10 minutes left, and for our viewers who are watching us on this Sunday, we are all talking on Thursday at the end of the week about financial regulation, and as it moves forward, the debate will continue this week coming up. Victoria, did you have another question?
Sure. I mean, another issue that's been in the headlines lately is the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And the deficits and the national debt is an issue that you've been very involved with in this country. To what extent should this be a warning sign for the United States? Are there any lessons to draw that you draw from what's happening in Europe to what might happen here?
This should be more than a warning sign. This should be some sort of huge flashing Las Vegas type neon sign that says, stop what you're doing, America, stop running your debt up and stop passing that debt on to the next generation at a rate that they can't possibly pay it back, because if you don't stop it, if you don't stop all this accumulation of debt, you're going to end up the way that Greece has ended up. Now, obviously Greece is a small country and they can't monetize their debt. That means they can't print their way out of their debt. But they're still reflecting the exact same template of problems which almost all the Western European countries have, which we have, and which Japan has. And the problem is pretty simple. We have promised too much to too many, and we don't have the capacity to meet all those promises in the future. And we're basically running up debt at a rate that is essentially at a rate where we can't afford to pay it back. Try to quantify it. American debt has traditionally run at about 35% of gross national product, the debt that we owe to people, you know, American citizens in China, most of it to China and places like that now. We're going to pass the 60% to GDP level this year, and we're headed towards 100% of debt to GDP level. When you've got a debt that's running over 60% of GDP, you're in trouble. When you've got a debt that's at 100% of GDP, you're basically at a junk bond status. You're heading towards the Greek situation or a banana republic situation, because you can't catch up with your interest payments, to say nothing of paying down your debt. And that's the path we're headed on. The American debt will double in the next 5 years under the President Obama's budgets, and it will triple in the next 10 years. And that's just a fact, and it's totally unsustainable, and it means that one of two things will happen if this continues, if we don't get our spending under control. And I'll get into that if you want to, but it is a spending issue, not a revenue issue. One of two things happens. Either you have to inflate the economy to pay for the debt, and if you do that, that's the worst tax of all, as they say, because it reduces people's savings, it reduces the value of your purchasing power of the dollars you earn. Or alternatively, you have to raise taxes so high that you reduce productivity dramatically, and that reduces the number of jobs being created. But that's the scenario we're passing on to our kids. We're literally putting ourselves in a position where, for the first time in the history of this country, one generation will pass on to the next generation a country where there will be a lower standard of living, and where our children will have less opportunity than we had because of the debt we're putting on their backs.
Well, where should budget cutting begin? I mean, should it be the Defense Department? Is Social Security a place that you should start? Where should Congress make the first big cuts?
Well, my view is we should cut everywhere, but where the money is entitlements. I mean, 60% of the federal budget is entitlement spending. And as a very practical matter, the major entitlements are Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid. The problem we have is that the last health care bill, this massive health care bill, which is going to fundamentally aggravate the problem, by the way, because it grows the government by $2.5 trillion, $2.5 trillion of new government spending, taking the spending of the government from what has traditionally been 20% of GDP up to 26% of GDP. That health care bill did have in it reductions in Medicare spending, fairly significant reductions in Medicare spending. $500 billion over the first 10 years, $1 trillion over the first 10 years when it's fully implemented, and $2 to $3 trillion over the first 20 years of reductions in Medicare spending. But instead of using those reductions to make Medicare more solvent, which is our most significant problem, the insolvency of Medicare, those reductions were taken and spent. They were actually spent on creating a new entitlement program for uninsured people who are not Medicare recipients, who probably haven't paid into the Medicare trust fund, and who certainly aren't senior citizens. And so as a very practical matter, we doubled down on the problem. We took money out of Medicare that should have been used to make it more solvent, and we moved it over to create a new entitlement, which we know by definition will probably be insolvent as it moves forward, because we always underestimate the cost of these. So we've increased the problem rather than reduced the problem with this health care bill. But we should still take a hard look at how we're going to control this rate of growth of entitlements. And so we've got to go back and look at these health care entitlements again. And basically, you got to do it by controlling health care costs. And we should look at Social Security. We can't afford the present Social Security structure we have. And we got to look at Medicaid. And we got to look at discretionary spending. So everything should be on the table.
Senator Gregg, President Obama has created a debt commission to look at this issue. Are you pessimistic, optimistic about this commission being able to come up with and agree on a solution?
Well, the commission has dealt some pretty tough cards because of the fact that the health care bill took off the table in a large degree a large amount of the issue, which is health care spending. If you look at the unfunded liability of the federal government, which is about $70 trillion in 3 accounts, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, the vast majority of that is in the health care accounts, Medicare and Medicaid. So I'm not sure how much more or how much more aggressive we can get in the area of health care. There are things we can do. There were things which were left on the cutting room floor, such as tort reform and other things that would significantly improve the health care costs in the out year. But they aren't the big items. The big items were addressed, as I mentioned, and unfortunately the money was taken, it was saved and put into a new entitlement program. So that makes it problematic for the Financial Commission to basically report something that's global. But there are areas where the Financial Commission should be able to make progress, and very fertile areas, in my opinion. For example, Social Security reform. This doesn't mean cutting Social Security benefits in some draconian way at all. It just means bringing them more in line with what we can afford over an extended period of time. This isn't going to be the event has to occur that creates the savings the next day type of situation. We're talking phasing this in over 20, 30, 40 years to make our system more solvent. So we can do something in that area, I hope, and I believe there's a genuine, sincere desire on the part of this commission to try to make progress, at least in some areas, to send the signal to the American people that we are serious about getting something done about this out-year debt.
I would just ask, in your time in Congress, as you're getting ready to leave, do you see the political will to make these sorts of changes increasing at all, or is that still a big hurdle that needs to be overcome in terms of addressing some of these debt issues? Well,
it's a huge hurdle, and unfortunately, I not only don't see the will here today in this Congress, I see just the opposite. This Congress is spending money like there's no tomorrow. It's adding massive amounts to the baselines on the discretionary side, and then of course it created this $2.5 trillion incredible expansion of the size of the government in the healthcare arena. So there has been, instead of an attempt to try to address this issue, an explosion of spending. Because if you're going to be very honest, and we ought to at least be realistic here, this is a government, the President said it forthrightly, and his congressional leadership here in the House and the Senate obviously follow this philosophy that believes that you create prosperity by growing the government. Now, I happen to think that that is not the way you create prosperity. I think you create prosperity by keeping the government's rate of growth at a manageable level, which means less than the rate of growth of the economy, and you give people the incentive to go out and take risks and be entrepreneurs and create jobs. But there is a philosophical difference here, and this, elections have consequences, and the consequence of the last election cycle is that this government is being grown astronomically, as I said earlier, and this is a huge number. Federal spending as a percent of gross national product since the end of World War II has averaged about 19.8% of GDP. At the end of this year, federal spending will be around 25% of GDP, and it's going up as this health care bill is phased in. So you're taking the size of the federal government and you are growing it exponentially. Now, federal revenues have historically been about 18.2% of GDP since end of World War II. But under the Obama budget, it is projected that revenues will actually go up to 20% of GDP. So it's not a revenue issue. It's a spending issue that's creating this huge delta, which is causing all this deficit and causing all this debt. And so unless you address the spending side and reduce the rate of growth of federal spending, you're not going to get this under control in a way that makes it survivable or sustainable for the next generation.
Senator, the Washington Post editorial on Thursday pointed to you and the work that you have done across the aisle with Democratic Senator Ron Wyden on tax reform and other issues, but pointed to you as someone who is also retiring, and that there is a lack of, that this election cycle coming up, that people who do not toe the party line, like they pointed to Senator Robert Bennett and possibly Senator Blanche Lincoln on Tuesday, will suffer the consequences of that. And I was just wondering your thoughts on what the Washington Post called partisanship and paralysis.
Well, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I think the Senate is still filled with people of goodwill and purpose, and you can't do much in the Senate unless you're willing to go across the aisle. It's usually a 60-vote place to begin with, and secondly, if you don't, on big issues, big complicated issues that affect most Americans, the American people aren't going to accept partisan responses or proposals. They want bipartisanship because, by definition, bipartisanship means there's been some sort of, hopefully, thoughtful input from various philosophical viewpoints, and it's seen as fair. So I genuinely believe that these really big issues that are very complex, like tax reform, which Senator Wyden and I put together, the first comprehensive tax reform proposal since the Reagan-Bradley proposal in 1986. Issues like that really have to be done in a bipartisan way in order to get the momentum and the support from the American people necessary to address them. So things like Social Security, Medicare should have been done this way. It wasn't. Tax reform, they need to be done in a bipartisan way, which is one of the reasons why Ken Conrad and I, the chairman of the Budget Committee, came up with the idea of the commission, where you make a totally bipartisan commission and have it report and have the Congress have to vote on the report. That, unfortunately, although it got a majority vote, didn't pass, but the president has picked it up with his executive order, which isn't as strong as what we proposed, but at least has taken a run at the same issue. So I genuinely believe, I'm not a pessimist about the willingness of members of the Senate to work together to try to resolve these big problems. Unfortunately, there is a definite centrifugal force around this place, driven in large part by the 24/7 hyperbole that occurs in the marketplace of ideas these days, which is almost all one-liners, that makes it difficult. But I still think there's a willingness to accomplish bipartisan agreement around here.
Perhaps there's a willingness, Senator, but the piece talked about the fact that those that do, like yourself, but you're retiring, those that do reach across the aisle suffer the consequences in primaries, like Senator Bennett.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that. Primaries are usually dominated by the ideological base of the party. That's traditionally the way it is. Now, I've been fortunate. I've been in a lot of primaries in my time, and I've been able to succeed, and I think there are a lot of good people who come through primaries, and I suspect there will continue to be. You just have to make your case effectively in a primary, but there's no question primaries are usually more ideologically based than the general elections.
I would just follow
one
up.
quick more question.
Sure.
Yeah,
one
please.
quick other election question. Democrats have enjoyed a lot of success in New Hampshire in recent cycles. As the race gets heated up for your seat to replace you, what's your prediction? Do you think Republicans can keep the seat?
I think we're going to see a huge resurgence in New Hampshire of what is the traditional New Hampshire approach of fiscal conservatism, strong commitment to the environment, and local control, and a belief in individual liberties. That's the Republican agenda in New Hampshire, and always has been the Republican agenda. Unfortunately, got overwhelmed in 2006 and 2008 by the real antipathy, which was very deep and very sincerely felt regarding the war in Iraq. And basically, that's what I believe caused the huge movement, which the Democratic Party took advantage of. I don't think that's going to occur this time. I think just the opposite is going to occur. I think a lot of people in New Hampshire are very worried that we're undermining our uniqueness. We call it the New Hampshire advantage relative to the rest of New England. We have no income tax and no sales tax, and now we have a Democratic state legislature which is spending money like there's no tomorrow, 17% increases year after year after year, and they're basically running us into a ditch which is going to force us. They're trying to force us into a broad-based tax. I think the New Hampshire people will reject that out of hand in this election. We'll recapture the state legislature, We'll recapture both of our congressional seats, and we'll certainly keep my seat. We've got some very strong candidates, amongst them Kelly Ayotte, our former Attorney General, who's a real talent.
Senator Gregg, we have to leave it there. Thank you for being our newsmakers.
Thank you.